Hands-on Apologetics. You have entered into Virgil Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. And yes, we are talking with Master Apologist William Albrecht on this distinction between mortal and venial sins, and is in the Bible, is in church history. And, William, before we begin, I want to give everybody an apologetic hack, if you will, a shortcut, a resource that you can go to. And this is something that you won't hear anywhere else on Catholic radio, even Catholic apologetic shows. Check out John Paul II's writing called Reconciliatio et Penitentia, or on reconciliation and penance, because in that work, John Paul II goes into the Old Testament and shows how the distinction between venial and mortal sins is already implicit within the law of Moses. And that's been, I don't know about you, William, but whenever this subject comes up, I pull out that little apostolic exhortation, and it's a gold mine of, all these distinctions that you find within the law.
No doubt, Gary. St. John Paul II does an incredible job there. And really, the one thing that I find most incredible about that, Gary, is the hearkening to the Old Testament, really being able to see, really being able to look and notice how this teaching was present from the very beginning. And I find that the most incredible, that this teaching, we find all of the teachings in our faith, but this particular teaching we're talking about today, this distinction, we find that as early as really the time of Moses, Gary, and I find that mind-blowing, really. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's like a kernel, that eventually grows to an oak tree. So, so where do we go? What's the earliest, if you will, the roots of this idea?
And Gary, you tell me that was a pun when you say root, because I'm going to use this tree. From the tree you shall not eat. The moment you eat from it, you surely are doomed to die. That is from Genesis chapter 2, Gary, 2:17. In the very beginning, Gary, we have got this teaching of mortal sin. And we know right here, literally in the Hebrew, we're told that they're going to die. They will die the death. But after they ate of it, did they die? They didn't die, did they, Gary? But we do know one thing. We know that they did die in a very serious sense. They were no longer partakers of the divine nature. And remember, they walked and they talked. They knew God, Gary, and they disobeyed God. They believed the lie. Yeah. They obeyed the serpent, and that was a grave mortal sin. And really, I think that's the first example we find of mortal sin in the Bible. But isn't it incredible that right already in the second chapter of Genesis, we read about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, God gave the commandment, and the commandment for Adam and Eve was don't eat from this particular tree. And, of course, they broke the commandment with full knowledge and consent. They deliberately do it. It wasn't like Eve made a salad and Adam unwillingly ate of the forbidden fruit. He knew what he was doing. And then you have that the consequence is that you'll die to death. And very good. Yeah, it's not physical death, but it's spiritual death. Excellent.
Yeah, and it's worse. Way worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you find it right there at the very beginning in Genesis, that sin is mortal, or there can be a mortal sin. Where else would you go?
I like to hop on over to Leviticus 5, Gary. Leviticus 5:17. Okay. We read, if any of you sin without knowing it, we talked about this earlier, doing any of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, you have incurred guilt and are subject to punishment. You shall bring to the priest a ram without blemish from the flock, or the equivalent, as a guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement on your behalf for the error that you committed unintentionally, the sin you committed, and you shall be forgiven. It is a guilt offering. You have incurred guilt before the Lord. Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but do we or do we not have a perfectly clear example of what a venial sin would be being taught to us as early as Leviticus 5 in the Old Testament?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because that is one of those three conditions for mortal sin. And I'm going to keep repeating it, folks, just to ad nauseum, because this is something you should have learned in catechism if you didn't. Grave matter, and then also full knowledge, and that it has to be a human act, a deliberate act. So an unintentional sin would not be mortal. It would be classified as venial. And, you have it right there in Leviticus 5. And, William, what's also interesting is there are different sacrifices for different kinds of sin in the law of Moses. Except for, like, the biggies where it's like you're cut off from the people or you're executed. So it's almost like, there's one kind of punishment for those kind of sins, but for the lesser sins, it's just a different kinds of sacrifice, which, to my way of thinking, shows that there's different degrees, of seriousness.
No doubt, Gary. And really, when we look and we notice one key thing: the Lord is offended either way, with a minor or with a venial or a mortal sin. The Lord is offended. But the one thing that we must be clear about is, in the Old Testament, some of these things would lead to the death penalty, to you being murdered. But here we read about an unintentional sin. We're told that a sin was committed without knowing it. Therefore, it is a minor sin. It required a trespass offering and not the death penalty. So as early as the Old Testament, there is a difference between a grave sin and a minor sin. And we have that from the very beginning, Gary. And the thing that I find, as we'll go on and on, most incredible, is as you go throughout the whole Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, and early church fathers, this same chain of teaching continues unbroken.
Yeah, very good. Because if it were true that every sin is mortal, then why would the Lord make a distinction in the Old Testament and kind of inculcate this in Jewish thought? If it was totally based on a false system that, no, everything is mortal, everybody should be executed for any sin we commit. Of course, there wouldn't be, the people of God wouldn't be around very long, would they?
Not at all. No.
Yeah, very good. So we have Genesis, we have Leviticus 5. Where else would you go?
Gary, you know me. I've always got to toss the Deuterocanonical book in. I've always got to do it. I love the Deuterocanon, Gary. And we know that the two Maccabees is part of the Bible, that Holy Writ, always been considered part of the Bible. I like to hop on the 2 Maccabees 12:39 says, on the next day, as it now become necessary, Judas and his men went to take up the bodies of the fallen and to bring them back to lie them with their kindred in the sepulchres of their ancestors. Then under the tunic of each of the dead, they found sacred tunics, tokens of the idols of Jamnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear, and it became clear to all this was the reason these men had died. So they all blessed the ways of the Lord. They all blessed the ways of the Lord, the righteous judge, who reveals the things that are hidden, and they turned to supplication, praying that the sin that had been committed might be wholly blotted out. The noble Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened as a result of the sin of those who had fallen. He took up a collection, man by man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver, sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking into account the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the beautiful, splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore, he made atonement for the dead so that they might be delivered from their sin.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so right there you can see that the distinction between mortal and venial sin, can't you?
Definitely, Gary. The thing that really does stick out to me the most, for the audience, open up your Bible, go to that passage. What happens here? Judas is walking around and he encounters men that had been fighting a war. Remember, they were fighting the war for the one true God. But unfortunately, they had kind of like good luck charms. Not a cross, but like an idol, like a good luck charm to bring them luck. They weren't worshiping another deity. They weren't pagans worshiping another god. They worshiped the one true God, but they had a good luck charm. They died with that. That was a venial sin. Why do we know that was a venial sin? Because we're told they died in godliness. They died in the grace of God, but they died with some sins. Therefore, what needed to be done? Atonement for the dead, prayer for the dead, sacrifice for the dead. Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but that sounds a lot like what goes on at Mass every time we go to church.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And especially since, there's the expectation that they will rise, that the godly will rise in the resurrection. That's why he did it. And now, of course, if it's mortal sin, we should still pray and sacrifice just out of the presumption of charity that